Right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are on the globe. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're delighted to have you with us today for a webinar. I'm Linus. I work for TUMI at GIZ. And this webinar series, Transportation and Resilience, is jointly organized by the World Resources Institute, the Mobilize Your City partnership together with Euroclima, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, the German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ, and TUMI, that's the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative. I hope you're all able to see my screen. And we have now about 100 participants online with more joining. I expect we will be about 200 today. And welcome. Let me show you the agenda for today. First of all, we're going to do a round of introductions of our esteemed panelists for today, and then we move into 3 presentations and a discussion and Q&A session together with all of you. So also with me today is my colleague, Victor Valente, also working at GIZ. Hi, Victor. And first up, we have our keynote presenter today. It's Franz Drees-Groß. He's the regional, oh, my apologies for the screen mishap. Franz Drees-Groß is the regional director of infrastructure at the World Bank and the former director of the Transport Global Practice. Hi, Franz.
Hi, Linus. Nice to be with you.
Second, we have Joni Orbea from the UN Environment Program. She's the electric mobility lead and also a former advisor for the C40 City Finance Facility and an former urban manager at the World Resources Institute. Hi, Joni.
Hi, Linus. Thank you for having me here.
Pleasure. Then last but not least, up in our line of presenters, we have Friedemann Brockmeier here from Civity Management Consultants. He's a partner and he's also a former guest speaker at the 2019 TUMI Summer School in Leipzig. Hi, Friedemann. Okay, so before we start off this discussion, I want to frame our discussion for today a little bit. Of course, one reason why we're coming together is our efforts to respond and to react to the COVID-19 pandemic all across the world. We at TUMI have just had a conference on May 26th, TUMI TV. You can find all materials online. We also have available an observatory on measures related to COVID-19 and sustainable mobility, which is growing and going to be expanded together with other organizations. And we also have a number of project-specific responses, and I'm sure that accounts as well for all the other organizations involved. So while we're able and have the privilege to join this webinar, I hope you're all well and safe wherever you are. Of course, these are challenging times, and we are well aware that it might not be as easy for everyone else to join and participate in these efforts, but we hope we can show a joint and mutual response and recovery from this. With that being said, we recognize that the pandemic is not over, quite the contrary. It's happening in several places to several degrees, and not all have experienced the same measures and reactions to it. We're talking here from full lockdowns to only minor restrictions. Of course, we're talking about different capabilities to cope with the pandemic. So that as a framing. And of course, we're not only talking about the mobility sector, but we're talking about many impacts on our daily lives. One of which is how people move in cities and across cities. And this is what we're going to be zooming in a little bit for today. I think the speakers are in a much better position to talk about how severely public transport has been hit by the pandemic, but just also in the context of this webinar, which follows other webinars, the next slide is going to be showing a few other topics that have been covered in the past. And I just learned from UIT, a webinar from UITP, that of course we're not talking only about a revenue crisis here for public transport, but we're talking also about like a cost crisis, since public transport operators have had to deal with much higher expenditures and emergency precautions. And we're also talking about a potential tax revenue crisis, and we're going to be going more into detail on that in the following. While we're experiencing this situation, of course, we see some cities, regions, countries moving from the first response actions to recovery actions. And I think that's also one stepping stone for our webinar today. It, of course, affects industries in different ways, but for the public transport side, while we're talking about recovery, we're also thinking, okay, what level of recovery are we going back to? What is the modal share in cities that we have been talking about pre-COVID-19? And here, 3 questions stick out particularly. The first one is how public transport operators can be supported to ensure the provision of their very needed services, and how they can be encouraged to modernize and continue with investments at the same time. The second question is maybe more geared to the government side, with the question how economic development measures can be utilized to also contribute to the sustainable mobility and sustainable development agenda. So these are also aspects that we won't neglect in the following. And then the third question would be, what are potential positive urban mobility impacts that can be made more permanent, or that can be where this momentum can be utilized to make necessary changes. And while we're talking about these measures, we want to focus this discussion or go beyond just the topic of green stimulus packages. Of course, these are necessary recovery options that have been talked about and will be talked about. But we have seen the first national transport schemes to include public transport in the wake of COVID-19. But we also would like to open the discussion at this unique junction in time, how mobility services, how the continuity can be ensured beyond just one-time stimulus plans. And I'm very excited to hear from our presenters and engage in the discussion and see what multiple answers will be possible in the following. That being said, just as a context of this discussion, and there have been multiple webinars in the past, of course, one from our partner UITP, then the World Resources Institute has also had a webinar or webinar series on building back better, where transport was featured. In this webinar series, we have discussed several regional impacts, and we've also started discussion with TUMI webinars on first responses and also more long-term recovery options. I encourage you all to, and these slides will be made available afterwards, to check out under the hashtag #MobilizeMinds every week what new learning opportunities are available online on the TUMI website. And with that being said, I have the pleasure to hand it over to our first presenter, Franz, who will give us an overview and lead us into this discussion. Franz, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Linus. Please remind me how to share my screen, because I still see your presentation up on the screen. Let's see.
Yes, will be shared with you any second.
Okay, show my screen. Let me see if I can.
Perfect.
Can you all see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. Let me take about 10 to 15 minutes to talk about COVID-19 and the recovery of public transport. Just to situate all of us, if this is Movilidad data from the evolution of ridership in major urban public transport systems around the world. Movilidad data is updated daily, and you can pick, as most of you know, basically most cities in the world. But I just picked a small sample from different regions, both developed countries and developing countries. And what you see in this data is that starting in about, sorry, back one, please. Yeah, there you go. So what you see here is that, starting in about mid-March, when most countries went into lockdown, you have this huge drop-off in public transport ridership. In Latin America, the region where I'm now the infrastructure director for the World Bank, basically in most public transport systems, certainly in major cities, you're looking at 65 to 95% reductions in transit ridership, so a gigantic ridership. And one big problem is that even as countries emerge from lockdowns, the recovery of public confidence in public transport systems isn't likely to be immediate. So let me just show you this slide. I picked 3 cities that have already emerged from lockdowns, right? So I've picked East Asia, of course, was where the COVID crisis all began. It's where countries adopted the first measures of social distancing, lockdown to varying degrees, but also where, starting in April, countries began to emerge from lockdowns, as most of Europe, South America, Africa, etc., are still firmly in lockdown. But look what happened. So if you take mid-April here on the bottom, and you look at what happened in Singapore, which is the purple line here, basically Singapore is still 61% lower now, 2 months after it bottomed out, than it was pre-COVID. So there hasn't been a rapid bounce back in urban public transport. If you look at the green line, that's Seoul. Seoul is still 20% below pre-COVID levels. And this is a country that basically is recognized to have handled the COVID crisis quite well. Hong Kong is still 18% below pre-COVID levels of public transport ridership. So the 2 messages I'd like to leave with everybody is, first of all, of course, there's been a giant downturn in public transport ridership, not surprisingly, with the lockdowns. But to emerge from the lockdown, the spring back of ridership isn't likely to be immediate. It's actually probably going to be a long, drawn-out process, even if we don't have a second spike in COVID, which, of course, nobody quite knows right now. So there's a big risk that in that situation, people could revert to not using public transport and instead use individual motorized transport, which all of us that care about public transport and sustainable cities, of course, don't want to happen. That's a really, it's a very daunting and difficult prospect that we need to counterbalance. So we just wanted to share some data of what that really means for public transport operators. In Latin America, we just finished last month a short study taking stock of the financial losses that public transport companies are suffering right now. So we looked at all the major countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, even through Panama and Peru. And collectively, we estimate that public transport operators are losing about $370 million every month. And they're losing it both because ridership is down, I've talked about that, but of course also because operating costs are up. So the cost of disinfecting systems is way up. The cost in general of operating systems has tremendously increased. In Seoul, we know they're disinfecting all of their vehicles 6 times a day. It's a big cost of additional manpower. So they're squeezed between additional costs and reduced ridership. So let me just say, now as we start to emerge from lockdowns, there's both a transport operational response and a financial response. And let me just make a few points on the operational response and then move to the financial response. I think we all have to acknowledge that in this emerging from lockdown phase, public transport has to be managed carefully so it doesn't become a vector for disease transmission. And in that context, even as we emerge from lockdown, the best trip is still the trip that isn't made. So wherever possible, governments need to incentivize firms that can work remotely to continue working remotely, at least for 1, 2, or 3 days a week. It's basically a way to reduce the flow of people into public transport systems. I know a number of countries that we've been talking to are looking at staggering working hours for government, the commercial sector, manufacturing, schools, construction, etc. Again, staggered working hours, especially of course in the morning as people go to work, and in the afternoon as they leave work, to avoid ridership peaks. The countries that have emerged first, I'm thinking mostly China, Korea, some of the East Asian countries, have launched massive public information campaigns about COVID smart use of public transport. In Korea, for example, we've done a number of webinars with East Asian transport providers and the ones I work with in Latin America. In Seoul, for example, all passengers are required to use face masks while riding public transport. Drivers have to use masks, gloves. They're protected behind plexiglass screens to protect their safety. In a number of countries, ridership is now in this post-lockdown period being specifically managed. In Colombia, public transport vehicles are mandated not to operate at more than 35% capacity. In China, we were talking to Shenzhen a few weeks ago. They have cameras in all of their buses, and anytime the occupancy of a bus exceeds 50%, a new bus is dispatched on that line to basically try to manage the flow, but with more vehicles and lower occupancy. A number of public transport systems that are moving more aggressively to electronic payment systems to avoid direct interactions between drivers and passengers. Nobody wants money changing hands in these times. There's an interesting experience which we discussed with Beijing that's piloting a smartphone app to contact trace. So what we've learned from Beijing, their view is it should be a voluntary scheme where they put QR codes on all of their public buses and all of their metro cars. And passengers who wish to do so can then scan that QR code with a smartphone app when they enter a car. So they may know that Franz Dries Gross entered a subway car number 17 at 9 o'clock in the morning at so-and-so station, etc. And it then tracks which subway cars and buses are used. And if many people use that, and one of them is later diagnosed with COVID, then a text message can be sent to my phone automatically from the Bluetooth function that says, Franz, sometime during the last 2 weeks, you were in close proximity with someone whose name, of course, is anonymous, who has now been tested positive. Please go and have a test done. Now, of course, if you were to do this outside of China, say in Latin America or Europe or Africa, you'd have to put in place, some additional measures to improve the governance and transparency about how the data is managed, to give everybody the confidence that the data will be used properly, that it'll be deleted when no longer needed, that there's oversight on the use. But it is a way to give people the confidence that should they be exposed to infection on a subway system, there is a way to notify them and at least encourage them to get tested. A lot of systems we've talked to are using floor markers to encourage social distancing in bus and metro stations. There's a hand sanitizer that's become quite ubiquitous, and frequent disinfection. Seoul is doing it 6 times a day. Shanghai has told us that they're doing a pilot for UV disinfection of their buses. Now, to the financial response, which is the heart of what I've been asked to talk about. I think the first point to ask yourselves and to understand is how tariff-dependent different public transport systems actually are. Because if your ridership is down and your tariff increase is significantly reduced, but most of your income comes from an operating subsidy, then you're less exposed to that downturn. It hurts you less. So this is from a study we did in Panama and released last fall. It actually draws on a lot of data from GIZ and CAF, and I would like to just acknowledge that. But what you see is just a selection of public transport systems around the world. On the far left, you see Seattle and Panama, the bus system, MIBUS, and that's basically systems that receive most of their OPEX through operational subsidies. So in the case of Seattle or Panama, MIBUS or Portland, you're looking at 75–80% operational subsidy. And on the right of the graph, you see cities that get most of their OPEX actually through fare revenue, not through an operating subsidy. Needless to say that the CAPEX subsidy is almost 100% in all systems. So most infrastructure is paid for by public funds. And this graph is just focusing in on the operating subsidy. So of course, in many developing countries, you're at the rider side of the spectrum, where the systems rely heavily on some fare income. So what to do? you have to backfill, of course, for this increased COVID-induced operational losses. Again, I mentioned the ridership loss, the cap in Colombia, the increased operating costs. So what are some options? We think that for formal public transport operators operating under concession contracts, in many countries where those are formalized contracts, you can shift more from a per passenger payment basis to a per kilometer basis. Because if you're telling buses to operate with fewer passengers, you have to compensate them by a greater availability payment just for operating a route according to a defined schedule and other performance parameters. Now, for informal operators, I think this is an opportunity to encourage formalization. You could, for example, India is looking at a way to provide a green COVID certificate, a smart operational certificate that shows you're complying with COVID-safe standards. You could require informal operators to use a GPS so that their routes can be tracked and more formalized. And you could make that a condition for financial support. You know, thinking medium or longer term, you might even be able to encourage some of the more polluting vehicles to be scrapped. So give financial assistance that operators need to survive, but in exchange for scrapping the oldest of their vehicle fleet and investing in cleaner technologies. Our overall conclusion so far is that virtually no country in the developing world that we've looked at really has the complete package of financial measures to deal with this crisis, but there's some good early thinking. Let me just show you one example from Colombia again, that's not from the transport sector, but I think might be interesting. So the Colombian government is using taxpayer money to capitalize an emergency fund called FOME. And then that FOME fund works with the local development bank. This is a national development bank called Findeter. And basically it issues bonds at zero interest that nobody would want to buy except an institution like FOME. So FOME buys zero interest bonds from Findeter, and that gives Findeter additional liquidity that then Findeter can pass through in terms of preferential financial lending lines to energy utilities or water utilities. So a number of countries around the world have local development banks. So one could think about lines of credit, low interest lines of credit with perhaps longer tenors that could be stimulated, that could be put in place, not just for energy and water utilities, but for public transport operators that are suffering downturns. Another interesting thing that Colombia is doing, it's recapitalized a national guarantee fund. And that guarantee fund provides credit guarantees to commercial banks, which then extend credit to SMEs. There's no reason why in other countries, instead of just making it general SMEs, those couldn't be public transport companies that are getting commercial lending, but with a guarantee coverage from a public sector institution. The advantage of that system, of course, is that you have some additionality. You're leveraging not just public money, including MDB and bilateral donor money, but some commercial financing from commercial banks. So what we propose is, and we're in discussions with a number of countries around the world on this, is to provide liquidity to public and private sector operators through lines of credit facilitated by national or state governments, or some kind of a guarantee facility that can leverage commercial lending. And I guess Findeter in Colombia is doing that, but only for electricity and water at this point. And what we propose is that these lines of credit or liquidity basically come with some conditions attached for the operators receiving those funds. So when you use public money, taxpayer money in the end, you have a right to, the public has a right to expect that the transport sector they get after all of this is done will be greener and cleaner. So in the short term, you might require recipients of these funds just to show that they're working in a COVID smart way. In the medium term, you might say they need to restructure their concessions to be paid more on a per kilometer basis, less on a per passenger basis, at least for the next couple of years. And in the long term, you might require them to make some green investments. You could say that, you know, after 12 months or so, any public assistance to these companies might be conditioned on purchasing electric buses to access financial support. And of course, this is a great opportunity to expand non-motorized transport. And I know cities in Europe, but also in Latin America and elsewhere are already doing that. So we have lots of new bike lanes going up, not just in Berlin and New York City and Milano, but also in Lima and Bogota. Let me just show you one more slide before you close. I mean, once we've gotten past the business of trying to save public transport operators and keeping people from reverting to individual modes of transport, there will be a whole economic recovery agenda. Just to put it in perspective, in the World Bank, we project that global growth will basically decrease this year by 5.2%. That's our global growth projection right now. That would be, if that actually plays out, as I've just stated it, that will be the steepest economic downturn in any one year since the Great Depression, so since the 1930s. So it's an extraordinary global economic downturn. And the question is, when countries start to emerge from that in 2021, how can we use infrastructure investment to build back better? And I want to show you just one slide. This is a slide that we did for Latin America after the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9, about how many jobs you can create with different types of public infrastructure investments. So if you spend $1 billion of public money and you plow it all into rural road maintenance, in Latin America on average, you'll create 250 to 500,000 jobs. And that's because most of that spend actually goes into labor costs and low-skilled labor costs. If you spend $1 billion on water and sanitation, you can create in Latin America about 100,000 jobs. That's because there's slightly more spending on, of course, pipes and fittings. In highways, $1 billion buys you about 10,000 jobs. Again, much more asphalt, other imported equipment. And then in energy generation, you create only about 1,000 quite specialized and high-paid jobs. And a lot of the spending goes for imported equipment. Energy efficiency, incidentally, different from energy generation, is a great way to create jobs. Basically, $1 billion worth of energy efficiency investment. So improvements to building insulation and other things creates about 32 to 50,000 jobs in Canada, a country for which we have good data for that. And we think it'll create even more in the developing world. So let me end here with that overview of public transport and infrastructure, how to get out of the COVID crisis and how to contribute to a green recovery. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Franz, for this first input. And we will definitely take up the topic of what's in 2021 and how about those jobs in the discussion. To all, if you have any questions, please just post them in the chat box at the bottom or the questions box, and we will collect them and feed them into our questions and answers session at the end. Thank you. So with that, we'll hand it over to you, Joni. Would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, we can see your screen.
Okay.
What is yours?
There you go. Right. Okay. So thank you so much for having me here. I think that there are many things that Franz already talked about that I already wanted to address. The main thing is that from our point of view of on the UN environmental program for Latin America, we think that the turning back, or rather the turning back to normal, is moving forward to whatever is coming next, must be green. As you said, linking those, that idea of the World Bank, that linking those financial assistance to greener transportation is basic. Within that, we have to move forward to something that is better for the environment, and also obviously for the people, but focused on how can we make something that is sustainable in the long term, but also sustainable, I mean, financially and also environmentally. So the first thing is that, you know, urban transport economics, I really like the topic, because this means really interesting industry to talk about. There are few characteristics that are really that make the industry rigid and low resilience. That is the main topic on how can we approach this going back to normal here in Latin America, that we are still mainly in lockdown. So as you can see on the screen, the public transport service provision cannot be stored or divided. The infrastructure can create some cost. That is the really big problem here on the infrastructure development, is that we can create really high investment on transportation, and then it comes something such as COVID or social unrest, and we create these sunk costs that has to be put in place on the long run. We have limited competition, and there is a need for regulation, and most of the transportation system are high pollutant right now. On the other hand, as already Frank stated, the COVID-19 disruption in the public transportation created a sharp decline of passenger ridership, but it didn't create such a sharp decline on service provision. So what we saw is that ridership may have gone down up to 90%, 80%, but then service provision didn't go that low. So we had to still give a lot more buses with lower capacity in them. So that also create even higher economic tightness for the service operation companies and institutions. We have additional budgetary restrictions. Many countries that are switching budgets from a normal service provision for public goods and public services to emergency services for the population, that we have to take that into account. And we just have realized really hardly that the transportation and the mobility is a key sector for the economy recovery and mobility reactivation in cities, and how we can move around. And we have come to a knowledge to that we are nothing without transportation in the city. So all these make UN Environment think about how we can propose a comprehensive response for the Latin American cities on how to build back better in a more comprehensive way, rather than only mobility, but some of the elements that you see in the screen are related to that. The first one is the deployment of renewable energy and energy efficiency policies. Second one is electric mobility. Obviously, as many of the countries in the region focus on public transportation, but also freight, also private transportation, also any other transportation and mobility services that currently are moving people on the cities and on the rural areas on the region. Gradually reduce fossil fuel subsidies. We still see that there are some countries that have these subsidies to non-renewable energy sources that have to be switched for this new normality and moving forward. Make ecosystems, food and rural livelihoods resilient, as well as making cities resilient. So in this, within this particular proposal that UNEP handed out to the countries in the region, and for the purpose of this presentation, we focused on the case of Santiago, mainly for two reasons. The first one is that, as you may know, they have one of the biggest e-bus fleets in the region and also in the world, and because they have somehow already overcome a COVID-19 kind of effect on the transportation system with the last year, October, November social unrest, that they already have a lockdown. They already had a pretty high and pretty intense ridership reduction on the system. So first of all, Santiago is a pretty special case in Latin America. It does have some pretty unique characteristics for transportation system in the region. The first one is it is an integrated transport system, both physically and the fare. We have buses, metro, and suburban train that are integrated into the same fare system and paying card. There is a deep governmental control and enforcement on service quality and revenue control and payments. That is pretty, as I said, pretty deep into the control part. we have a public control revenue collection, which means that they do control the revenue collection system, but also the payments to the open companies, which 90%, mostly around 90% approximately, goes to transportation services, and another 10% goes to all the service provisions for the system, that is fare collection, user information, etc. There's a public information about deficit and budget allocation that makes the subsidy that they receive openly for public. As Fran said, if it's public money, citizens have the right to get better services, to know what is being done with their money, and in this case, they have the chance to know that. They have this remuneration scheme for the private operators that is approximately 20% per kilometers and 80% passengers, and is updated every 2 weeks. And the income, as we saw in France's slide, is almost 0.5% by the subsidy, and the other 50% by user fare, that is calculated and is updated every 6 months, if I'm not wrong, based on a calculation formula on how the costs of the system rise. They also have this biannually study on the deficit, on the deficit projection for the next 2 years, and there is a subsidy that has to be publicly approved by the government of Chile. So yeah, we do think that these characteristics of the system made possible to engage and include some e-buses in the system, but we have to actually focus on certain things that made that possible. So the first one is that the DTPM, that is the controlling institution or the organizing institution of the transportation system, make a contractual change on the e-bus linked, let's say. So to the company, the e-buses are now linked to the route instead of the company that operates it, meaning that if the company for any reasons go bankrupt or go out of the system because of more bad quality service or whatever, those buses will still generate income, so they can be paid for the utility company that bought them. That make the utility company be sure that they will get back their investment. And the other one is that it was a little increase on the payment by kilometer done or run by those e-buses. On the other hand, as I already talked about, they have these October 2019 social protest and social unrest that actually made one of the highest ridership decrease in Santiago, meaning that only 70% of the fleet was in operation at some days, and did affect heavily the private operators' economic balance. This situation linked to the COVID-19 disruption that actually make that only around 20 to 40% of the ridership are riding right now in the buses, or in the buses and the metro. But they still have up to 80% of the fleet in operation, is even more difficult situation for the private operators. So what the government did is that they create this contingency plan based on what happened in October, to make the companies be able to keep on running. As Fran said, they change, or their yes, they changed the remuneration scheme to pay higher percentage by kilometers rather than by passengers. So they kind of changed that 20% they used to pay by kilometers to something to a bigger percentage. So the private operators could have more certainty that they will have their incomes coming. So based on what we've seen that can be done in Santiago, and I must say that is very, very particular case in Latin America, and not many other cities and systems can handle that. We know that the answer to this crisis on transportation must be something and a combination of many things that has to be economically and environmentally sustainable. So we think that this moving forward to a new transportation system, there has to be two focus. The first one is providing good quality of service and for the riders, meaning what we used to know as good, what we used to know as be punctual and be good routes and not to wait too much and all that, plus the sanitation, and on the other hand, we have to focus on the improved air quality and in the environmental sustainability. On the big view on the transportation system, we think that it cannot be only focused on the service provision, but also on what can it be done and what else can mean for the economic sector and for the industrial sector of many countries in the region. So we have to have transportation systems that revamp the regional vehicle production, that foster new value chains, create jobs, and these new jobs should be focused on green jobs, gender perspective and gender-oriented jobs with new and more value added, and promote new business models. So as we do know that there is a big difference among the countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean, that cannot have the same answer for the same problem that they may have right now. Our approach is to help authorities to account for all impacts, for both beneficial and harmful. So we have to acknowledge what is good from the transportation system, what is bad from transportation system, so we can link not only, as I said, not only on the service provision side, but also all on the industry and all the jobs and all the GDP generation that a transportation system value chain can create. We know that we have to build a strong capacity in new technologies, but also in finance structures and finance products. We believe that the solutions come from innovative ideas, as Franz said, on these guarantees, on this vendor finance, on this kind of products that can be delivered to the cities, but have to be well managed, and countries and cities and need to know where are the what is going on, how to manage those products, how to manage those finances to actually take the most out of them. And it has to be all under a strong and robust institutional and legal environment. So finally, the main lesson or the main thing that we've learned from the e-bus deployment strategy and what happened to Santiago in these last 6 months or 8 months is that we need to create this certainty to private investment. The public budget tightness is there. It's gonna be even more tight in the next future, in the short term and maybe the midterm also. So we have to leverage private investment, we have to leverage money, we have to take out most of the private investment that we can gather. We have to develop this new contractual arrangement. Not everything or not only is giving out money for the private operation of public institutions that run the transportation systems, is also creating new contractual arrangement that can de-risk the transport system, that can create lower risks for the investors and for everyone that have money in the systems. We have to leverage the new bulls bus technologies characteristics. We know that the subsidies, operational subsidies, are not the most efficient way to expend the public money. We can think of how, in this case, electric buses can having lower operational cost and probably lower a slower increase on the operational costs in the long term, but higher purchasing cost. How can we use that money to invest in those vehicles that can provide long-term economic sustainability for the system? How can we leverage those technologies? I mean, electric buses, but also any other technologies that may come around that can provide this long-term economic sustainability. And if needed, if the public subsidies are needed, then how can we make those more efficient? How can we actually mobilize more private money using less public money? And that will be it.
Okay, thank you, Jone. I like the note that you ended on, and you definitely left us some food for thought here, recounting the double crisis in that sense from Santiago. So yeah, let's take up these 4 points later in the discussion. And we already got a question asking about the third kind of crisis, namely the climate crisis, which is also a point to consider. And I encourage all of you again to put your questions in the questions box. Feel also free to relate to these 4 points mentioned by Jone, and mention examples from the places where you are at. But before that, we'll go to our third presenter, Friedemann Brockmeier, who will dive with us more into the genesis and the theory of how to fund public transport.
Okay,
Friedemann,
yeah, thank you. I have to share. Can you see my screen already?
Yes.
Ah, that's great. Yeah, thank you for having me here and the possibility to talk a little about new innovative instruments for funding public transportation. I guess this was already a large discussion in Europe before COVID-19, and it has become a larger, it's quite bigger discussion we have now after COVID-19, because as you all know, public budgets are tightened, and the economic crisis leads to less tax revenues, and therefore we have to think about new funding instruments for public transport if we want to solve the climate crisis, if we want to have if we want to run these large investment programs. We have already planned to double public transportation demand until 2030 in most of the European countries, and therefore we need new funding instruments. But we have to know and we have to consider that funding of public transportation in Europe, but also in other countries, as far as I know, also in the United States and in some countries in Latin America, is based on three principal pillars. The first one, and this is common known, it's the user-based financing. That is funding public transportation by farebox revenues, and this should be an adequate participation of passengers in financing public transportation. It should be based on payment options, on different willingness to pay, and it should, of course, performance-based and socially balanced. But as we all know, that the willingness to pay is not high enough to fund and to finance the very expansive capital expenditures, as well as in some countries, at least for operational expenditures. We need additional sources of funding. The most common one is here the third pillar. It's the public funding. It's a standard approach focusing on financing the transport infrastructure, the rolling stock, the buses, and so on, financing these capital expenditures through taxes or to public debt. That's one. It's a really important pillar, and in most countries, it's the most important pillar for funding public transportation. But there's also not very well-known pillar, and we call this pillar the third-party user or the beneficiary financing. This is about to look into public transport and to see that public transport is not only the transport service itself. It's about, we call it, as economist, I call it the positive externalities of production and consumption of public transport. And there are different so-called third parties which benefit from these positive externalities. These are traffic generators such as employers, retailers, hotels, etc. These are, of course, property owners, because we all know there's a direct correlation between land value and public transport connectivity. And of course, these are motorists, because if everybody would use the streets or would drive by car, no street, no city in the world had enough capacity for all cars. So these are three important third parties, as we call them. And I will explain that in the beginning, that these two pillars are really in the beginning of building public transport systems in Europe, are the most important sources of funding. And afterwards, as public transport was used as an instrument for social inclusion and to include working districts and so on into the public transport system, public funding become a more prominent role in funding the public transportation system. And as maybe some of you know, last time I've talked about the example of Vienna. I will start today about the example of Berlin. And not everybody knows, but the metro system in Berlin, built in 1900, already built some years ago in the early 90s, was in the 19th century, was a joint venture of what is today Deutsche Bank and Siemens, two very important major industrial and financial corporations in Germany. And they fund this company as a joint venture, as a commercial joint venture. They had the idea to generate profits from farebox revenues. They had really a business plan, and they had a concession. And it was not that very easy to get this concession, because there was also a competitor, the German sister company of General Electric. But in the end, they won this concession, and they've built an underground line in Berlin. This is today the lines U1 to U4. And the first fares were regulated from the beginning on. That means that the city government was very keen about that the fares are not too high, and that everybody has the ability to buy such a ticket, but to buy tickets for such a metro system. Then in the beginning, it's obvious, if you build a commercial metro system, you have to focus on the most dense populated areas where you can expect the highest density. But as you can imagine, after they built this metro system, it becomes very popular, and we had not the situation that mass motorization was already in place. And the first private real estate developers really thought about, what could happen if we want to build a new development area, and it would be a good idea to connect this development area to the metro system, because we know it's so popular and it will increase the value of our property. And these are the two most famous examples. The first one is the extension to the U3. This is an area in the southwest of Berlin that was created as Germany's Oxford, and today it's the home of many important research institutes of the German Max Planck Society, as well as the Free University of Berlin. And the other example is the U2. It was built to a new built residential area for the wealthy bourgeois in the western part of Berlin, but the former independent and richest city of the German Empire, the Charlottenburg. And as you can imagine, villa mansion areas, as well as with wealthy bourgeois residential areas, they are not very dense populated. That means the demand is not high enough to operate and build a metro system on a commercial viable basis. And that was the idea behind the so-called free metro. It's a metro system which is fully paid by the property developer and operated by this Berliner Hochbahngesellschaft. It's the Berlin Elevated Metro Company, this joint venture of Siemens and Deutsche Bank. And until the 20s, 1925, 1926, the whole operations of the whole metro operations were completely commercial. And in the mid of the 20s, the city of Berlin has decided to build and to operate new metro lines, which expanded and included the working class neighborhoods the working class neighborhoods. And you can still see the difference, because the diagram of the metro lines U1 to U4 is much smaller as the diagrams of these new built metro lines. And that means at the end of the 20s, the early 30s of the 20th century was the beginning of building metro lines funded by taxpayers' money. And that's what's important to know, because at this time we have switched the system to a complete different system. And now it's still in Berlin. We have an ongoing discussion about who is participating from our competitive public transport system, and who should be included in the funding scheme for public transportation. And what's the economic rationality behind? And you can see it's very schematic. It's very easy. It's very easily explained. On the left side, we have this traditional view. We have a public transport user. We have a public transport operator. The public transport provider provides the public transport service, the ride, and the public transport users pay some money for that. And of course, the consumption of this public transport service, as well as the production of this public transport service, generates positive external effects of consumption, as well as positive external effects of production. And that's the reason why we, or in some countries, this is the reason why public transport is provided by taxpayers' money, because we all know it's better to use public transport than to use a private car. And we call it, as an economist, I call this the internalization of this positive external effect by taxpayers' money. It's a simple mechanism, but it's not completely fair, because we know that not all positive external effects are completely equally distributed about society. And so we have to ask the question if this internalization by taxpayers' money is from a social perspective, is this right? And that's the reason why we are talking about this third-party user model. We have the same model like the traditional view, where we have public transport service provision by the public transport operator, which is paid by money, the usage. But there's also this third-party user, this beneficiary, who's the free rider. And so there are different ideas behind this third-party user. And here, for example, we have 5 different types of these third-party users, which are benefiting from these external benefits. First of all, and that's the most important reason why it's paid by taxpayers' money, is the citizen itself. We all are benefiting from a competitive public transport system through cleaner air, less noise, and so on. But if we are looking into public transportation, if we looking into this whole theory about providing public goods, public services in the right way, when we know that the scarcity of public transportation is artificial, that if you are looking into the public transportation demand only for a few hours per day, so in the morning and in some cities in the afternoon, if you have this so-called peak time, there's really a rivalry and there's a scarcity about the public transport capacity. But most of the other time of the day, public transportation supply is high enough and is sufficient enough for all people. And the idea behind this is, if the scarcity is artificial, and you know from the so-called club good theory, it's the best to have a different provision model and the so-called compulsory subscription model. This is really a hot topic right now in Europe, and many cities, including Berlin, are really thinking about an compulsory annual pass for their citizens. So each citizen has to buy or has to subscribe for public transportation by law. That's one idea. Another idea is, of course, is with motorists. I've explained at the beginning, motorists are really benefiting from the fact that roads are remaining free if other motorists are using public transportation. And so it's an economic rationality behind the idea to levy motorists and to include them in financing public transport. The same is around employees and business. We all know that the labor and human capital is the most important production factor in cities. We all know that these cities are based on service industry, and bringing people to their workplace is really, it's something like a supply chain. And so you can also argue, if we are providing a competitive, reliable and safe public transport system, with is the supply chain system for service companies, because we all know that manufacturers, which are really relying on goods and on raw materials, they have to set up their own supply chain system. And so it's also an argument to include employees into financing public transportation directly. And the most important beneficiary or third-party user are the property owner. We all know there's a direct correlation between public transport competitiveness, or between public transport connectivity and the value of property. You can really, if you're looking into maps about property prices, and you can really see in most countries that where you can really identify the lines of public transportation if you're looking in maps of house prices or property prices. And the same is around investors. If you want to build or if you want to develop new areas for housing, for commercial activities and so on, it's much easier to develop these areas if you have public transport connectivity. And we know, if you're looking into this different types of sometimes animation is a problem. There are different examples. That's not complete. That's not it's not exhaustive at this time. But these are the most prominent examples. I have mentioned it already. For citizens, we are really thinking about this citizens ticket. It will be maybe not that easy from a law perspective, but the idea for this compulsory subscription model, for this compulsory annual pass, has gained some momentum right now in some European countries. We are talking a lot about motorists. We are talking about parking fees. We are talking about congestion charges. And of course, we are talking about special taxes. We are talking about special levies for employers. And we're talking about so-called land value capture. That means special taxes, special instruments to capture the value increase of property. And of course, if you're talking about extending public transportation to new development areas, about so-called public-private partnerships, and to include or to to think about that investors have to finance at least the capital expenditures to some part for such an extension of existing public transportation system. And if we see on the map, we can see already a lot of examples. The most famous one in Europe is, of course, is the so-called congestion charge in London, in Stockholm, in Milan. But there's also right now the plan or it's already happened in Copenhagen, one of the most impressive metro expansion programs during the last decade, and to the so-called land value capture. It's Eurostat. It's a complete new residential and commercial area, and the metro extension was funded by this land value capture instrument. And there's also right now a plan to build a new island in the Öresund and to connect this island with the city center with a metro system. And there's also the idea to build this metro completely and finance this metro completely by land value capture. There, of course, and it's also a very famous example, is the special employer tax in France. We have the same model in Vienna. I've talked about this model. A few weeks ago, but it's not only on a European scale we can see these examples. We have, of course, we have the same examples, a lot of them in other countries. We have this Hong Kong, but also some cities in China are very famous for this land value capture model. We all know the famous example of MTR in Hong Kong, but there are also pre-PP models in Sao Paulo. We have this special sales tax model in San Francisco, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. And we have also, for example, in Nigeria, a special registration tax for cars, which is directly linked into public transport system. It's not a specific model for advanced countries. It's also a model which could be possible and feasible in the global south. And it's right, there's a time to conclude. And this is maybe to give you some takeaways, at least from my perspective. We really have to reconsider that public transport, there is a chance to operate public transport fully self-sustained. That means if you're looking into the origins of mass rapid transportation in Europe and in North America as well, these origins are driven by commercial intentions. It's not driven by politicians who think, oh, it would be a good idea to build a subway in New York. There were different subway companies and they built it with commercial intentions. We know that the consumption and production of public transport leads to positive external effects, and we have to reflect this positive external effects. That means we have to internalize them, and we have to leverage beneficiaries with new innovative financial instruments to generate money, to extend the capacity of public transportation system. And we know, and I really think, if I'm thinking about that, and if I'm looking into in the most different examples and what could be transferable to most of the countries, when we are really talking about the land value capture and specific taxes. These are the most prominent examples for these funding instruments, and I really believe in that. And now that's very complicated from a political perspective, but with the right choice and combination of funding instrument, a self-financing public transportation, that means without taxpayers' money, would be basically feasible. And what would make this idea would make the public transportation industry as a whole much more resilient in future crises. And of course, and it's a first idea, but the problem really in most European countries and introducing if you want to introduce such an instrument is really that the legislation is much more complex than in the global south. And I really believe it should be much easier in most countries of the global south to implement these financing instruments, because you have not the same complex legislation we have here in Europe and in the public transport industry, and you have no possibility to shape your industry and to really think about Are there possibilities? Are there with so-called third-party users, and how we can involve them in financing public transportation? Yeah, that's it. I'm sorry for I've needed a little bit more than promised, but thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions and remarks.
Thank you very much, Friedemann, for delivering more than promised. So this is another great final slide. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague and co-moderator, Victor.
Hello guys, can you see me? Yes. Okay, I'll share my screen now. So first of all, thank you very much for the presentations. I think now we have some questions already that I would like to use the time to pass to the panelists. So yeah, first question that I would like to address to all of you is this really the right time to think about more private funding instruments for public transport? Would this mean more resilience? In what sense? So please, who wants to go first?
I'm happy to make a start, Victor, if you like. I mean, I think
yes.
Let's just look at the big picture, right? Right now, even before the COVID crisis, many countries in the world had very little fiscal space. So they didn't really have a lot of additional resources. They didn't have a lot of capacity to take additional debt from the World Bank, from bilaterals or multilateral investments. So now comes COVID, and the governments are taking a much bigger role. They have to, right? So they're paying for households in many Latin American countries, for example, some kind of a public subsidy, just because they're forcing them to stay at home. They have to pay them because otherwise they'll starve, right? They're telling water and electricity companies in Latin America that, sorry, poor people aren't going to pay their bills for the next 3 months, and give them the chance to reschedule that over 36 months. All that makes perfect sense. It's an immediate measure. But governments are going to have a huge many demands coming towards them at a time when they don't really have a lot of resources. Resources from health, or demands for support the health sector. Obviously, we're in a pandemic. Education sector, educating kids from home that can't go to public schools. So public transport is only one of many, many open hands saying, help me, help me, help me, right? So the search for some private financing isn't because we think it's a fun idea. The reason is that governments just don't have all the resources, right? So anytime you can put in place any scheme, like a guarantee scheme, that gets some commercial financing to top up whatever public money you have, that's a bonus, right? And we're doing it because we need it, not because it's just intrinsically a fun idea or a nice idea, right? Now that said, it's actually really hard right now, because if you look at private investors, a lot of them were confident to invest in public transport systems, at least in South America, because there was a perspective of stable or even growing consumer demand. Right now, as I showed in those early slides, it's really not clear where ridership's going to go, right? So you're going to have to change the package of conditions in these public-private partnerships to de-risk it more for the private sector. So you're going to have to give them traffic volume guarantees, whereas before maybe you wouldn't have had to do that, right? The same isn't just true for public transport, it's true for toll roads and other places. So essentially the package has to take on more risk on the public sector side. That's reality. But if we don't do it, what's the alternative? The alternative is the transport that's already 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions will increase even faster. You know, it's been very, very hard as countries get richer to maintain, let alone expand, but even just maintaining public transport ridership as a fraction of total trips, that's hard work, right? Are we going to throw all that away, right? And let people go back to private cars? Of course not, right? So, but I think it's the private financing isn't a choice. It's a necessity at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks. Someone else wants to answer this one? Because I think it is a very general question that makes a lot of sense. Joe was also mentioned the private money. I think There's another question regarding the same. So what are the advantages of opening financing lines to say private operators at the expense of local or national government in the developing world, which may face strong macroeconomic restrictions such as high rate of public debt GDP? So in comparison to the implementation of directly state-owned public transport systems. So this is from Thiago, this question, and goes in the same direction.
If I may, I just adding on what Franz said, I think one of the ideas that we stand for in UNEP is that, as I said, transportation is a service provision. So we provide transportation services, but also creates jobs, also creates industry. I mean, not all the countries have it, but many countries in the region, like Mexico, like Brazil, like Argentina, they do have automotive industries, pretty big ones with a lot of employment. They have innovation. We have the lithium triangle. We have a lot of things that we can link to that service provision. So as Franz said, it's not a choice right now. There's a really strong public budget tightness. So we cannot overcome that. Leveraging private money to actually provide the services that is needed to the economy to thrive, to people to actually be able to get to their jobs and all this and all whatever they need to do is necessary, but also linking that and accounting all that benefits, all that GDP growth that can be related to that, all those families that are the drivers, the maintenance people, all the things, all the world, the industry that moves beyond the bus running in the streets. That is all the value chain is that we have to account for. So if we get to provide the public transportation services linked to an industrial growth and green employment and linked to the energy transition and to everything that can be accounted within that industry, is that actually makes sense for a big view on what is coming on and all these crisis that we see that is coming into Latin America.
Thanks. I will now ask Friedman, following up, will we see less or more state funding of infrastructure moving forward post-COVID? What are the risks of handling primary responsibility of infrastructure investment and transport operations to the private sector? So it's rephrasing the same question as well.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's true. We have this large economic stimulus packages, and we now have a lot of money right now in 2020, maybe in 2021, but afterwards the capabilities are limited to fund and to finance public transportation, and we have to overcome this large recession, and I would say on a global scale. And of course, there's a difference between advanced economies and developing economies. I know that, and all my experience with private money in public transportation is about to give the risks to the state, to public authorities, and have a chances on the private side. And I really believe in market mechanisms and capitalism and so on, but I don't believe in that private money is the solution for our problems and our solutions we need in public transportation. Public transportation as a whole need a lot of money if we want to deliver our contribution as a public transport industry for stopping, not really stopping, but to deal with the climate crisis. And that means we have to expand public transportation massively during the next decade. And private money is always about de-risking, and that's really the problem. And so I don't believe in private money. I believe, of course, we need public money, but that's not available. So that means we need other sources of money, which is allocated by public authorities. And that's the reason why we in Europe are thinking about this new innovative instruments, about thinking about, okay, where are beneficiaries? where people, where are companies, where institutions, where are benefiting from a competitive and well and reliable and sustainable public transportation system, and we have to levy them and we have to include them in funding public transportation. It's not private money. That's very important. It's money which comes from private or commercial institutions based on a system, on a law system, and that means it's allocated by public authorities, and that gives public transportation systems the possibility to plan better and more independent from demand. And one very short remark on that, because we in the German-speaking countries have a very specific system. We have not the problems with this revenue decrease like other countries, because our public transportation system is not based, or is not in the same way, relies not in the same way on pay-per-use customers, pay-per-use user. We have a very important dominance of so-called subscription and annual pass models. That means we have a decrease in this annual pass holders of 2 to 3% in most regions. That means the revenue decrease is not that dangerous for operators and authorities. But really the danger is where taxpayers' money will be not available during the next decade to have enough money to fulfill all the ambitious plans and to extend public transportation.
Thanks. I will hand over to Franz now. Another question. Franz mentioned the support from national development banks. So a lot of emerging countries don't have budget to support informal or formal transportation. Is there any international or regional program that can help to support this mobility enterprise in COVID-19 period? And also adding, you mentioned in your presentation this criteria, greener criteria, that banks could say, we can lend the money, but you should follow those criteria. Is this discussion also being taken in the World Bank, within the World Bank, or in which context, with which institutions participating? If you could elaborate also on that.
Yeah, so maybe just to give you an idea, we are essentially a development cooperative. We're owned by 182 member countries, and we have paid-in capital, which we use to lend to countries that are a little bit richer, and we have an IDA pot, which goes to the poorest countries. In normal times, say pre-COVID, we do about $50 billion of lending a year between those two pots to public recipients. Now we've committed that in this fiscal year and the next fiscal year, which is for us at the end of June of next year, we will be providing $160 billion worth of financing to help countries deal with $160 billion of financing. So it's a giant step up that is going to demand a lot from our capital base, but also front loading of our lending under the IDA envelope. Now, how countries spend those envelopes is really up to them. We don't tell them, oh, you get, let's just say a number, 3 billion out of that 160 billion, and you have to use it for public transport. It's up to them to decide how much they want to put into schools or health centers or public transport. We don't tell them that. But when they decide to earmark some of that for public transport, and we encourage them to do that, we then say, use it in a smart way. Think of it as not just a source of money, but spend it in a smart way. So use it maybe as through a guarantee to leverage some commercial financing. Use it, impose some conditionality on the recipient. So don't just say, I'm going to save this bus company at any price, but require them to do certain things to deserve the public support. So for example, you might say, look, in the first 6 months, what we have is basically a public health crisis. So you get your money, but you have to show me that you're complying with COVID smart operating practices. You need to show me that all of your buses have hand sanitizers, that you're operating at no more than whatever, 35, 50% occupancy. To show me you're disinfecting your buses 6 times a day, blah, blah, blah. You all do these things, you qualify for the financing. Then afterwards, you might say, well, now you have to do some additional things, right? You may have to become operationally more efficient, because in the end, these are lines of credit that need to be paid back, right? So you have to improve your revenue base. In the longer term, you might also say, well, now we're getting into recovery territory. You need to green your fleet. If you want to keep getting this access to public financing, you've got to bring in more e-buses. You have to scrap all buses that are older than X years or higher than some emissions. So, you know, when somebody gets public money, our money or taxpayers' money directly, etc., they should have to work for that, right? And they should have to show that they're delivering a social benefit for that to merit the fund. Maybe I can make just one more point, Victor. There was a comment earlier, you know, should we be giving this money to private operators or to public ones? I'd like to separate 2 points, and I think Friedemann already did a great job teasing this apart. The 2 words that really are important to think about is financing versus funding. Funding is basically, in the end, pays for everything. And in the end, it's all of us. Everybody connected to this video conference, in the end, is going to pay for public transport systems. And you pay for it through 2 pockets. You reach into your left pocket, you're a taxpayer. You reach into the right pocket, you're a ratepayer. So either you pay through user charges or you pay as a taxpayer. But in some way, it's the same people paying all the time, right? It's always, in the end, the user. The private sector provides financing, not funding. So the private sector can be a way to basically unlock investment temporarily, but the private sector unlocks that investment with the expectation of being paid back over time. That's normal. That's how the private sector should work, right? So the private sector isn't a new way to fund something. It's a way to finance something in the short term, but of course that money has to be repaid from the only 2 pockets that exist, the private, you know, me as taxpayer or me as ratepayer. And I'm agnostic about whether the systems are operated by public or private firms. In Bogota, it's predominantly private firms, right? In many Latin cities, it's predominantly public. What I care about is that the service is provided at a high quality, because when it's not, it's mostly the poor that lose, right? So it's a social question. Who provides it? I don't care. The issue is it provided well and efficiently? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, an interesting question here regarding, I'm wondering, someone wrote, if you have any insights on informal public transport operators in the Latin American Caribbean region on how they have been adapting to COVID regulations, how governments encourage regulation adaptations. You mentioned green certificates in India and strategy in working with the informal public transport, which is mostly in Latin America. We know that this is also an important part of the transportation, how people move in the cities, right? So if you have any comments on that, this was a general one, didn't address anyone specifically. Don't know, John, if you wanna jump on that.
The truth is that we from UNEP don't work that directly with the transportation companies, neither public or private. We mostly work with governments, but as far as I know, in at least here in Mexico, what has been happening is that informal transportations have been adapting to the demand that they had. So they will, those are resilient, let's say, right? They will just go out one day, and if they see enough people, they will just run the route. If they don't, they will go back. But this is just my perception from what is going on in the country, not rather than the proper study. So.
I could just add to it, Victor. I think Jordan has the same impression that I do, which is right now what you see is a lot of ad hoc responses, right? You know, some owner of a little mini bus goes out, yes or no, they may or may not be complying with social distancing. And what we're saying is, and frankly, everybody right now that I've looked at, any developing country, is really at a very early stage of thinking about how to help, you know, how to work with these informal operators in this environment. India is thinking about a green COVID certification scheme, but it isn't operational. I mean, these are early discussions, even with India, right? That you could say, well, you know, if you observe social distancing, if you protect the driver, if you have sanitizer on your vehicles, et cetera, you abide, then you get a little sticker that says you're COVID compliant, and you maybe at some point, not now, you access some kind of financing as a reward. But these are ideas, right? Nobody's actually doing this yet, right? And that's what I think is interesting thing about this discussion. It's really governments are just starting now to wake up to say, well, we're going to have to step in. These companies have now been not getting money for 2-3 months. We have to step in. It's hitting crisis proportions. How do we do that? What do we demand? And in my mind, it is an opportunity to try to formalize some of the informal operators, right? We've wanted to do that a lot of times. It might be a way to get some of them to leave the market and to get into other professions. We know that you know, in many cities there's an excess supply of at times very poor quality, very polluting vehicles that drive very dangerously around routes, and you know, all the street corner to pick up that extra passenger, right? Who then probably dies as two public transport buses collide to pick him up. So I mean, there's a lot of issues with informality right now. So it's an opportunity, but nobody that we can see has yet really come up with a good package to deal with it. Thank you.
Well, I guess we already reached our time. It's already 5:30 p.m. here in Germany, and so I would like to wrap up. I would like first of all to thank you for participating. Friedman had to leave for another meeting, but he also sent a message here in the chat. I would like to thank you, Franz, for all your thoughts. We see that you are really into the topic and really focus on thinking of solutions. Thank you, John, for also to participate and also bring us this view from Latin America and electromobility. We know also you were yesterday talking about the electromobility and other webinars. So I would like to thank you also. Friedman wasn't here to say goodbye, and I'll hand over now to Linus to just do the final wrap up as the moderator.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Just a few notes. If you go to our website to quiz.transformative-mobility.org, you can take a quiz and see what you learned during this webinar. Apply some of the insights you got. As always, keep following us under the hashtag #MobilizeMinds, and we will get back to you with the presentations and the rest of the questions that we weren't able to finish in time via email. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next time.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.